All right, hello again, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the brain model that you need to learn for lab and the brain stem model that you need to learn for lab. So first, what we see in this picture, we're looking at the brain from above, and at the top of this picture, this is the posterior side of the brain. That's the back of the brain or the back of the head. And then down here at the bottom of the picture, this is the anterior portion. So it is as if this person is looking downward. So this would be the front area of the head and the back area of the head. Now, there's not a whole lot that we can see in this picture, just some generalities. The part of the brain that we're seeing, this big kind of wrinkled looking structure that we typically have in our head when we think about a brain, that is called the cerebrum. And the cerebrum, you can see it's kind of cut in half. Each of these halves is called a cerebral hemisphere. So the whole thing is a cerebrum, and it is divided into two cerebral hemispheres. And when we look at the brain, you can see it's very wrinkly looking. There are some raised areas and some kind of sunken in or folded in areas. Each of these will have a specific name given to them. The raised parts, each one is called a gyrus. So any part of the cerebrum that is raised is a gyrus. And then each of the folds, the sunken in part, is called a sulcus. Gyrus is raised, sulcus is the folded in part. And since there are so many of them, we give plurals. So if there's more than one gyrus, those are called gyri. More than one sulcus are called sulci. So gyrus, gyri, sulcus, sulci. And some of them are actually very prominent and have names associated with them. So this part right here, that is a sulcus, but it separates two parts of the brain. And that sulcus is called the central sulcus. And similarly, there's another structure that divides the two cerebral hemispheres. Now, this is not a sulcus. This goes deeper. And these structures are called fissures. Fissures, they're similar to sulci, but they go deeper. And this particular fissure is called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure divides the two cerebral hemispheres. And similarly, the cerebrum is also divided into several lobes. And the lobes, when we learn these names, will sound very familiar. We learned them back when we were learning the baby doll, back in Lab 1, and we learned them when we were learning the bones of the skull, back in Lab 6. This front part of the brain, everything in front of or anterior to this central sulcus, this is right behind the forehead, right behind the frontal bone. So this is called the frontal lobe. Right here on the top of the brain, this is called the parietal lobe. And there are a couple of more lobes that we can't see from this view. Now, from this view, though, we can see quite a bit more. Okay, so to review a couple of the things that we saw on the previous slide, here is that central sulcus that separated the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. But we can also see a large sulcus here and that separates yet another lobe. Here we see the temporal lobe. And one that's a little less prominent, we'll see actually some of it is on the internal view, but there is another sulcus that kind of runs this way, and that separates the rear of the brain. This is the occipital lobe, and it is separated by the parieto-occipital sulcus. So we can see now that these larger named sulci separate the different lobes of the brain. To review, here we have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Now, we also see another fissure right here. Remember, fissures are like sulci, but they run deeper. And this is called the transverse fissure. And it separates the cerebrum that we've been talking about from this large brown structure right here called the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is separated from the cerebrum by the transverse fissure. Just beneath the cerebrum, we see this little bean-like structure here. This is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, if we think back to when we were learning the skull, when we took the top of the skull off and we're studying the inside, there was something called the sella turcica that looked like a little saddle. And that's where the pituitary gland sat. Here, this whitish structure, this is a part of the brain stem, and there are two features here we need to know. The larger area right here is called the pons, and just beneath that, this area right here is the medulla oblongata. Now, a lot of people will simply shorten this to the medulla, but we really can't call it the medulla and be correct, because as we're going to see when we get to Bio 139 or A&P2, there are a lot of structures in the body that have the word medulla. And really, medulla is just a word that means the middle of. So here we have to say medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. So here inside the skull, we're looking at the medulla oblongata. And right about here, it leaves the skull through the foramen magnum and becomes the spinal cord. Now we've turned the brain over, we're looking at the inferior surface of the brain, or the bottom of the brain. And there's only a little bit of new information here, but we can still see the frontal lobe. On each side, we see the temporal lobes. We can still see the medulla oblongata and the pons, and of course the large brown cerebellum. But we can see from this view that the cerebellum also is kind of divided into two portions. So we would say that this is one cerebellar hemisphere and another cerebellar hemisphere. So just like the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, the cerebellum is also. And again, here we can see the pituitary gland. And one other thing that we can see in this view, this little stalk that the pituitary gland is hanging from. Now, this is not a structure that you need to know this semester, although you will when you get to Bio 139. This little stalk that the pituitary gland hangs from is called the infundibulum. The infundibulum will play an important role when you get to the endocrine system in Bio 139. A couple of new structures that we do see in this view are two of the cranial nerves. And right here, these little white structures that project forward, these are the olfactory nerves, and they are cranial nerve number 1. This is where we get our sense of smell. And just in front of the pituitary gland and the infundibulum, we see right here cranial nerve number 2, which is the optic nerve. And the optic nerve is responsible for our sense of sight. These two nerves here, the optic nerves, bring impulses from our eyes, from our retinas, to our brain. And right here we can see those optic nerves, they kind of cross to make an X. And this point, right where they cross, has a name. This is called the optic chiasma. And chiasma means cross or X. So this point, right where the optic nerves cross, is the optic chiasma. Now in this view, we have cut the brain into left and right hemispheres along that longitudinal fissure. So this is a midsagittal section of the brain. And just to kind of orient ourselves, right here is the central sulcus. Here is that better view of the parieto-occipital sulcus that I talked about. Here is the transverse fissure. Now, that means that here is our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and cerebellar hemisphere. We cannot see the temporal lobe from this view. The pituitary gland has been removed. We don't see it in this view, but we do see the optic chiasma right here. Now, I really want to point this out because if you are studying one of the models in our lab, a lot of the models are mislabeled. A lot of the models are calling this structure right here the optic chiasma, and it is not. That is not a structure that you need to know. It is something called the mammillary body. But remember, the optic chiasma is where the cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, crosses. And right here is the optic nerve. So this structure right here, that is the optic chiasma. Now we also see this kind of large C-shaped structure, and that's called the corpus callosum. We also see a couple of small structures right here, little bumps. Now, each of those bumps has a name, but before we look at the individual names for them, let's think. There's a bump right here that is above a bump right here. So the one above is going to be superior, the one below is inferior. So the superior is called the superior colliculus. The one below is called the inferior colliculus. There is a left and a right, so there are 4 colliculi. Superior has 2, inferior has 2. All 4 of them together make something called the corpora quadrigemina. So when you're looking at your lab manual, you will see this structure right here called the superior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina, and here the inferior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina. So corpora quadrigemina is just all 4 of them together. Now that corpora quadrigemina here, along with this region right here, collectively make something called the midbrain. And just above the corpora quadrigemina, this little structure right here is called the pineal gland. Just in front of all of that, this area right here is the thalamus. Really, it's this whole area right here. The thalamus, And just below that, this area right here is the hypothalamus. So thalamus is all of this area. It does not technically include the brown spot there. That's a structure you do not need to know. And the hypothalamus is here just below that. Now if we move over and look at the cerebellum, remember this is a cerebellar hemisphere since it's been cut in half. Inside of it we see this white branching structure. This white branching structure is called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life, but we must use the actual term arbor vitae when we're labeling it. So on the inside view of the brain, we can see there is a lot of material that's visible here, so make sure and spend plenty of time studying that. And now the different model. This is the brain stem. So this is a very enlarged portion of just a part of the brain that we were just learning. And to kind of orient you, what we see right here is the pons and a part of the medulla oblongata. So we're looking still at a part of the brain. It's just no longer to scale with that other brain that we were just learning from. And what we're learning here are things called the cranial nerves, and there are 12 cranial nerves. You need to know them by name. You need to know them by Roman numeral, and yes, we do have to use Roman numerals. And you need to know what their functions are. So I've labeled them here by Roman numeral, and the first thing that I want to point out is cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve. It actually comes off of the cerebrum. It's not coming off of the brain stem, so it is not visible on this model. The other 11, though, are on this model, and I've got them labeled here. So you need to know, if we point to one of these on a lab exam, which one is it that we're pointing to? So, like I said, number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Number 2 is the optic nerve, and that's where the optic chiasma is found. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Number 4 is the trochlear nerve. Number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. Number 6 is the abducens nerve. Number 7 is the facial nerve. Number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Number 10 is the vagus nerve, and I want to pause briefly here to tell you that the vagus nerve will play a significant role when you get to Bio 139 A and P2. So kind of keep in mind what the vagus nerve does when we learn that in a moment. Number 11 is the accessory nerve, and number 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. It can be difficult to remember which Roman numeral goes with which name, so it's really good to find a mnemonic that sticks with you. One that I usually use is O, to touch and feel vermin. Gosh, vermin are hideous. And that gives you the first letter of the name of each of those in order. So O, to touch and feel vermin. Gosh, vermin are hideous. At least that way I can narrow down. All right, so if you're talking about cranial nerve number 3, it starts with the letter O. So I can narrow it down that way. Now there are other mnemonics. What I really recommend is finding one that's really, really vulgar, and some of them are very vulgar. And the reason that I say that is because vulgar things tend to stick in our minds a lot longer and a lot easier than other things. I'm not going to give you any of the vulgar ones because that would not be appropriate, but I will recommend that you go and search for those, and they'll stick in your head quite a bit easier. Now, in addition to knowing the names and the Roman numerals, you must know their functions. Some of these, the functions are strictly sensory, like the sense of taste or the sense of smell. Some of them are strictly movement, like movement of the eye, or some of them are a mixture, both sensory and movement. So how do you know whether or not it's sensory, motor movement, or both? Well, there's a mnemonic that goes with that also. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. And that way we can go through, for example, cranial nerve number 1, some, S, sensory. Cranial nerve number 1, olfactory, is the sense of smell. And we can just go through. If it starts with an S, it's sensory. If it starts with an M, it's motor. If it starts with a B, it's both sensory and motor. So let's go through those. Like we said, number 1, the olfactory, was the sense of smell. Number 2, the optic nerve, is the sense of vision. Number 3, the oculomotor nerve, is superior, inferior, and medial movement of the eye. Number 4, the trochlear nerve, is movement of the eye. Trigeminal nerve, number 5, is the sensation of pain, touch, temperature, and chewing. Number 6, the abducens nerve, is lateral movement of the eye. Number 7, the facial nerve, is facial expression, secretion of saliva, secretion of tears, and sense of taste. Number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, that's your sense of hearing and your sense of balance. Number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, is the sense of taste and also the secretion of saliva. Vagus nerve, number 10, contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle, sensory reception of visceral organs. Number 11, the accessory nerve, swallowing and movement of the head. And number 12, the hypoglossal nerve, movement of the tongue. So that's a lot of information from this one model, but on an exam, you can expect to have one of these cranial nerves indicated, and it will ask you what is the Roman numeral, or what is the name, or what is the function of this cranial nerve. Or they could simply ask you something like, what is the function of cranial nerve number IX? And you should be able to answer that. So spend a lot of time with the cranial nerves. One good way to do this is use your lab printout. Slide one that is unlabeled down into a sheet protector and use a dry erase marker. Go through and place the Roman numeral like I've done here and the name. Wipe it off and do it again. Wipe it off and do it again. And once you've got that down, then you can kind of write out cranial nerve number IX and write its function, cranial nerve number I and write its function. And that way you can start making associations. That brings us to the end of this video. There will be another video over the spine and other parts of the nervous system.